Turn with me, if you would, to 2 Samuel 13. 2 Samuel 13. I thought, as our old elder Wesley Baum used to say, if you looking for something to talk about, just tell the old stories. So I thought we might look at an old story of political intrigue and murder. It starts with a really horrific violation of this innocent girl, and it ends with a war between a father and son, and over 20,000 soldiers end up dying in battle. It's quite a story. 2 Samuel 13, and we'll start in verse 1. Maria is just now opening her Bible. As soon as we get there, as soon as she gets there, we'll get started. But here we have 2 Samuel 13. So here we have, and I'll just set the context while Maria is still searching for 2 Samuel. This is the reign of King David, of course. This is after chapter 11, 12, and here we are in 13. It's kind of a rather weak period for David, and usually thought of in terms of the weakness of the faithfulness of David during this period. In chapter 11, we had the story of the adultery and the murder of Uriah. You have the humiliation of sin and the chastisement of God with the death of his son that essentially took the wind out of his sails, and God had promised him more troubles even beyond the death of his son. Hey, how you guys doing? Good to see you. 2 Samuel 13. We're just going to go look at an old story. In any event, God had promised him more troubles even beyond the death of his son. In 2 Samuel 12, he tells him, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house." And these things do indeed happen in this story. And David has been essentially staying at home, sending others in his place to fight Jehovah's battles. And Darby points out how much happier David was when he was hunted like a partridge in the mountains by Saul. Then he had a living faith and a good conscience before God, but now in power, in the midst of God's blessings, David followed his own will, and as a result, there would be repercussions for his sins beyond the God-ordained death of his illegitimate son. He would, in a sense, reap what he sowed through two of his sons here, who would choose to follow David not in faith, but in abominable selfishness. So 2 Samuel 13 and verse 1. "And it came to pass after this, that Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister, whose name was Tamar. And Amnon, the son of David, loved her. And Amnon was so vexed that he fell sick for his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin. And Amnon thought it hard for him to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shemiah, David's brother. And Jonadab was a very subtle man. And he said unto him, Why art thou, being the king's son, lean from day to day? Wilt thou not tell me? And Amnon said unto him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. And Jonadab said unto him, Lay thee down on thy bed, and make thyself sick. And when thy father cometh to see thee, say unto him, I pray thee, let my sister Tamar come, and give me meat, and dress the meat in my sight, that I may see it, and eat it at her hand. So Amnon lay down, and made himself sick, and when the king was come to see him, Amnon said unto the king, I pray thee, let Tamar my sister come, and make me a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat at her hand. Then David sent home to Tamar, saying, Go now to thy brother Amnon's house, and dress him meat. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was laid down, and she took flour and kneaded it, and made cakes in his sight, and did bake the cakes. And she took a pan and poured them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, Have out all men from me. And they went out every man from him. And Amnon said unto Tamar, Bring the meat into the chamber, that I may eat of thine hand. And Tamar took the cakes which she had made, and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. And when she had brought them unto him to eat, he took hold of her and said unto her, Come lie with me, my sister. And she answered him, Nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. And I, whither shall I cause my shame to go? And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee. Howbeit he would not hearken unto her voice, but being stronger than she, forced her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, Arise, be gone. And she said unto him, There is no cause. This evil in sending me away is greater than the other that thou didst unto me. But he would not hearken unto her. Then he called his servant that ministered unto him, and said, Put now this woman out from me, and bolt the door after her. And she had a garment of diverse colors upon her, for with such robes were the king's daughters that were virgins apparelled. Then his servant brought her out, and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head, and rent her garment of diverse colors that was on her, and laid her hand on her head, and went on crying. And Absalom her brother said unto her, Hath Amnon thy brother been with thee? But hold now thy peace, my sister, he is thy brother, regard not this thing. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother's Absalom's house. But when King David heard of all these things, he was very wroth. And Absalom spake unto his brother Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon, because he had forced his sister, Tamar. And it came to pass after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baalhazor, which is beside Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. And Absalom came to the king, and said, Behold, now thy servant hath sheep shearers. Let the king, I beseech thee, and his servants go with thy servant. And the king said to Absalom, Nay, my son, let us not all go, lest we be chargeable unto thee. And he pressed him. Howbeit he would not go, but blessed him. Then said Absalom, If not, I pray thee, let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said unto him, Why should he go with thee? But Absalom pressed him, that he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, Mark ye now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say unto you, Smite Amnon, then kill him. Fear not. Have not I commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. And the servants of Absalom did unto Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and every man gat him up upon his mule and fled. And it came to pass while they were in the way that tidings came to David, saying, Absalom hath slain all the king's sons, and there is not one of them left. Then the king arose and tare his garments and lay on the earth, and all his servants stood by with their clothes rent. And Jonadab, the son of Shemiah, David's brother, answered and said, Let not my lord suppose that they have slain all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon only is dead. For by the appointment of Absalom, this hath been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore let not my lord the king take the thing to his heart to think that all the king's sons are dead, for Amnon only is dead. But Absalom fled. And the young man that kept the watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there came much people by the way of the hillside behind him. And Jonadab said unto the king, Behold, the king's sons come. As thy servant said, so it is. And it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of speaking, that behold, the king's sons came and lifted up their voice and wept. And the king also and all his servants wept very sore. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. And so Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and was there 3 years. And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. Isn't that interesting? So, here we have this horrifying account of the awful wickedness of Amnon, a son of David, a name that means faithful. And he was everything but, as we saw with the with the raping of his half-sister. And this is why she told him, the fact that she was his half-sister is probably why she told him, now therefore I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee. She felt that maybe because they were half-siblings with different mothers, that the king may allow him to marry her. Matthew Henry said that if Amnon had not forsaken God in the first place, he would have never given himself over to such evil, wicked affections. Grace is not inherited, but the corruption of sin is, which every parent must address with their children, no matter who they are. We do not find that David's children imitated him in his faithfulness, but rather in his selfish indulgences, probably thinking along the lines of, if David himself is not put to death for murdering Uriah, what should I have to fear for doing the same thing? I too am above the law, so to speak, and I can do whatever I want. In verse 3, you have this friend Jonadab, about whom it was said that he was subtle, which was also said of the serpent, which to me implies a satanic influence of some kind, perhaps given permission by God. Satan was personally involved in destroying David's family. And when Jonadab should have given Amnon wise counsel about the evils of his desires, he instead subtly suggests a wicked design to carry out the inclinations of his flesh. He starts by asking questions, just like the way serpent asked Eve questions in the garden. He probably knew he was lovesick, which is why he asked about why he was so thin. He essentially says, you have the power of a prince to command whatever you want. Use that power. Gratify yourself, just like Jezebel speaking to Ahab. You know, when she said, dost not thou govern Israel? Power corrupts, and the abuse of power is the most dangerous temptation of the powerful. Had Jonadab been what he had pretended to be, which was Amnon's friend, he would have counseled him the evil of his desires and what an offense it was to God and what a wrong it is to his own soul and to his sister, half-sister. Of course, Amnon followed his suggestions and thus got Tamar within his reach. He made himself sick, and like it said in Psalm 10, thus he lieth in wait secretly as a lion in his den to catch the poor and to draw them into his net. David clearly fond of his children, he no sooner hears that Amnon is sick that he actually comes to visit him, which shows a lot about the love that David had for his sons. David saw no reason to suspect any wicked plotting on the part of Amnon. He orders Tamar to go and attend to her sick brother. Tamar innocently goes to her brother's chamber. Though she was a king's daughter, she was a great beauty, she was well dressed, yet she did not think it beneath her to knead cakes and bake them for her brother, which says a lot about her own integrity. And once alone, the mask was thrown off, the meat is thrown by, and the wicked wretch calls her sister and yet asks her to lie with him. And yet, I have to say, I was really moved by what she said beforehand. I don't think anything could be more well said or with greater strength of argument than what she said to him. She calls him brother, reminding him how unlawful all of this is. This was expressly forbidden in the law. Now, some of the commentaries would go to Leviticus 20:17, talking about incest, and the consequence for that was to be cut off from the people, but this was a case of rape, and the penalty for rape, Deuteronomy 22:25, was death. Then the man only that lay with her shall die. Anyway, Tamar told him, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. That is, he would be looked upon as the worst of men and the biggest fool because he was the firstborn, first in line to the throne. And he would lose everything by committing this act, which would make him the biggest fool of all. But all she said was to no avail. Reason and logic does not always persuade barbarism fueled by sinful lust. And when it was over, his supposed love quickly turned into hatred, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. His hatred was likely not only anger over her rejection, as it was the fact that the sight of her would forever remind him of his own sin. He probably hated her because he hated himself for what he did to her. Fulfilling the desires of the flesh does not bring happiness, but self-loathing. And interesting, when word got out about what had happened, this rape actually changed all of Jewish culture at the time. Tradition teaches that after this, no one in Israel would let a young man and a young woman be alone together. For, they said, if the king's daughter be so used, what will become of the daughters of the private men? In verse 19, we're given Tamar's bitter sorrow over what happened, the manner in which he sent her away all disheveled after what happened only brought her shame, which was just horrific. She rent her fine clothes in a token of her grief, put ashes upon her head, loathing her own beauty, and she wept. She stayed at her brother Absalom's house because he was her own brother, and there she lived in solitude and sorrow in token of her modesty and detestation of this uncleanliness. Absalom spoke kindly to her. He asked her to regard not this thing. In other words, he would seek vengeance for what had happened. And it should seem by Absalom's question when he says, has Amnon been with thee? That Amnon was apparently notorious for behaving this way because Absalom predicted it just based upon how she was. But the most interesting aspect to me of this story, the one that keeps making me go back to this every once in a while, is David's reaction. He was very wroth, it said in verse 21, and yet he did nothing about this. Why was that? Josephus had suggested that David didn't act because of his great affection for Amnon. But then again, you can't help but wonder, was he afraid of just simply all this extra shame that would bring him on the heels of his own shame regarding Bathsheba and Uriah? Did David perhaps feel he was morally impotent to punish Amnon because of his own sins? Perhaps thinking along the lines, who am I to force punishment on Amnon when I myself was not put to death for Uriah's murder? Gabeline wrote, he said, alas, who was responsible for it all? The scenes of lust and murder, outrage and bloodshed, revolt and rebellion, sorrow upon sorrow, grief upon grief, start with David's great sin, for it is difficult to wield a heavy sword with a maimed arm. Or perhaps David just simply did not want to deal with the grief of having to put to death his firstborn after all the grief he went through when he lost the child that he was to have with Bathsheba. Maybe he blamed himself and felt that he needed to be punished more so than his own son. We don't know why David didn't act, probably for all of these reasons. I'd say a great big howl yes. But if David hadn't sinned with Bathsheba and Uriah in the first place, he may have been in a better upon Amnon. David's lack of action here is what made Absalom feel that he had to take matters into his own hands. I'll pause right there. Does anybody have any thoughts they want to add or anything along those lines? For a while, in the middle of this chapter, I sympathize with Absalom. I sympathize with the fact that there's got to be a great sense of frustration in David's lack of action about his brother, his desire for justice, and in his case, vengeance. And the passing of time, it's interesting that the passing of time of 2 years did not lessen his rage, or what I'm sure he views as righteous indignation for what had happened to his sister. Nothing less than the blood of Amnon would have satisfied him. But there was due process under the Mosaic law, and if the system failed him, which by all appearances it looked like it would, since the perpetrator was the king's son and the king wasn't apt to do anything about that, then Absalom, his recourse would be he need only leave it in the hands of their righteous God. And interesting, Absalom was really clever. He said nothing to Amnon about this matter, neither good nor bad, nor did he let Amnon in on his rage about any of this. And it's amazing that he managed to hide this from him. He appeared as if he did not know about it, maybe, or that he didn't care, and maintained towards Amnon his usual civility, while waiting for an opportunity to carry out what he viewed as justice. His words were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. And 2 full years, Absalom nursed this bitterness inside of him. And I forget who made the point. If the sun going down once upon the wrath gives such place to the devil, as Paul talks about in Ephesians 4, then what would the sunsets of 2 full years do to a man? So then Absalom lays out this design. He has a feast at his house in the country on occasion of sheep shearing, a kind of celebration of his business. Probably this estate was probably given to him from David. The king would not go to this celebration, probably because he didn't want to put him to the expense of entertaining him. It wouldn't be cheap to entertain the king and all his entourage at his house. So David was just being considerate of Absalom. Absalom got permission to take Amnon to his house and all the rest of the king's son. And neither David nor Amnon had any reason to suspect foul play, which is amazing. Of course, we know the story. They became merry with wine. At least Amnon was, which may have been a tendency for him. And Absalom had Amnon murdered by his servants, and everyone ran away, including Absalom. He was as much afraid of the king's sons as they were of him. They fled from his crime. He fled from fear of their retribution. This wasn't justice, this was murder. And no part of the land of Israel would actually shelter him. So the cities of Israel would not give him refuge. So he actually had to go to his grandmother and grandfather on his mother's side, Talmai, this king of Geshur. And there he was protected for 2 years. And David never demanded his release. And I suspect, Talmai probably thinking himself obliged to send him back to David only if he had demanded it. And it was interesting to me that in the last verse of chapter 13, in verse 39, and the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. Isn't that interesting? David mourned for Absalom, and yet he was comforted about the death of Amnon. Why was he comforted? Probably because he knew Amnon wouldn't hurt anybody else. And probably because he was relieved.
And he knew where he'd be.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I want to get into 2 Samuel 14. Get into a few verses in the next chapter. Does anybody have any thoughts before we move on? 2 Samuel 14:24. And we're going to keep going until we get to 15:16. Now, at the beginning of this chapter, you have Joab. Essentially, the first half of this chapter, Joab, he has this woman who he kind of dresses her up. She goes into David's court, and under kind of false pretenses, she talks about a brother that's gone and tries to persuade David to allow Absalom to come back to Jerusalem. And David figured out what was going on and why she was saying what she was saying and who sent her, and he allowed Absalom to come back to Jerusalem, but he refused to see his face. So 2 Samuel 14:24, and the king said, let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face. So Absalom returned to his own house and saw not the king's face. But in all Israel there was none to be so much praised as Absalom for his beauty. From the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he pulled his head, for it was at every year's end that he pulled it, because the hair was heavy on him, therefore he pulled it. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels after the king's weight. And unto Absalom there were born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. And she was a woman of fair countenance. So Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, and saw not the king's face. Therefore Absalom sent for Joab, to have sent him to the king, but he would not come to him. And when he sent again the second time, he would not come. Therefore he said unto his servants, see, Joab's field is near mine, and he hath barley there. Go and set it on fire. And Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab arose and came to Absalom unto his house, and said unto him, wherefore have thy servants set my field on fire? And Absalom answered Joab, Behold, I sent unto thee, saying, Come hither, that I may send thee to the king to say, Wherefore am I come from Geshur? It had been good for me to have been there still. Now therefore let me see the king's face, and if there be any iniquity in me, let him kill me. So Joab came to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. Chapter 15, verse 1. And it came to pass after this, that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, Of what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant is one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said, Moreover, O that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. And on this matter did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said unto the king, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow which I have vowed unto the Lord in Hebron. For thy servant vowed a vow while I abode in Geshur in Syria, saying, If the Lord shall bring me again indeed to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said unto him, Go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as ye hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. And with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong. For the people increased continually with Absalom. And there came a messenger to David, saying, The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. And David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, Arise, and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly, and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servants said unto the king, Behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. And the king went forth, and all his household after him, and the king left 10 women, which were concubines, to keep the house. So 3 years Absalom had been in exile with his grandparents, and now 2 years in Jerusalem. He was unable to see the king, and in both circumstances he was being dealt with better than he deserved. Yet he was unhumbled by any of this. His ego only grew because he got away with this crime of murder. Instead of being thankful that his life was spared, he thinks himself wronged, that he is not restored to all his places at his father's court. Again, if David was restored to his position as king, being a murderer, why shouldn't Absalom? Absalom longed to see the king's face, pretending it was because he loved him, but really because he wanted an opportunity to usurp him, because he viewed him as weak. The mechanics of rebellion were already in motion in his mind, and you have this bit of a power play with Joab. You know, once and again he sent to Joab to come and speak with him, but Joab would not go, because he probably felt that Absalom should go to him because of the kindness he had done for him in bringing him back to Jerusalem. Proud men take every service done for them as for a debt, but instead of this, he bids his servants to set Joab's fields on fire. As spiteful a thing as he can do, and strange that Absalom should think by setting Joab's fields ablaze that he would do him a kindness to recommend to the king that he should be able to see him. Absalom was obliged by the law to make restitution for setting the fields on fire, yet we do not find either that he offered it or that Joab ever demanded it. Joab not only puts up with having his fields set ablaze, but he actually goes on his errand to the king to do Absalom's bidding. Maybe he feared more fires, I don't know, but Gabeline said of Absalom that behind the beautiful exterior there was a proud, violent, and evil spirit. Absalom told Joab, "Wherefore have I come from Geshur?" He denies his own crimes and will not own that there was any iniquity in him for doing what he did. He became insufferably proud because he went unpunished for what he had done. And he could not be content with being allowed to live, being the honor of the king's son and the prospect of being his successor, but he had to be the king right now. The sharks were circling David because they thought they saw blood because of David's weakness in this matter. Absalom defies the king's justice. "If there be any iniquity in me, let him kill me," knowing full well David loved him too much to do that because he wouldn't do that with Amnon. And being weak in this matter has made David susceptible to a mutiny in the eyes of Absalom. And mutiny is what came in fast. Absalom is no sooner restored to his place as court that he aims to be in the throne. And Matthew Henry said, when Absalom was restored to the king's favor, if he had any sense of gratitude, he would have studied how to oblige his father and make him easy, but on the contrary, he meditates how to undermine him by stealing the hearts of the people from him. Gabeline said, once more we notice here the consequences of David's fatal weakness as manifested in his irresolution and half measures. Morally paralyzed, so to speak, in consequence of his own guilt, his position sensibly and increasingly weakened in popular estimation, that series of disasters which had formed the burden of God's predicted judgments now followed in the natural sequence of events. If ever before his return from Geshur, Absalom had been a kind of popular hero, his presence in Jerusalem for 2 years in semi-banishment must have increased the general sympathy. Absalom, he looks great. Verse 1, I think, and it came to pass Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. That is quite a show. Makes him look desirable, while his father on his mule probably looked desirous. The people desired a king like the nations, and such a one Absalom would be, appearing in all pomp and magnificence above what had been seen usually in Jerusalem. Samuel had foretold that this would be the manner of the king in 1 Samuel 8:11, that he shall have chariots and horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And this is Absalom's manner, 50 footmen running before him to give notice of his approach, which would satisfy his own pride and the people's fancy. But had Absalom proved himself a good son and a good subject and set himself to serve his father's interest, he would have done his present duty and shown himself worthy of future honors after his father's death. But to show how good a judge and how good a king he will be is but to deceive himself and everybody else. Those are good indeed that are good in their own place, not those that pretend how good they would be in someone else's place. But this is all the goodness we can find in Absalom. And he wished that he was a judge in Israel in verse 4. Had all the pomp and all the pleasure he could he had all the pomp and all the pleasure he could wish. He lived as great as any man could. Yet this will not content him unless he have power too. Oh, that I were judge in Israel. He should have been judged himself. He should have been judged himself to death for murder. I have no idea what I really butchered this sentence. And he should have been a good judge of himself for the murder he committed before he ever thought himself of being a good judge for others. I'll just say it like that. We don't read of Absalom's wisdom, virtue, or learning the Mosaic laws, nor had he given any proof of his love to justice, but just the contrary. He wishes he were judge because he did that which was right in his own eyes without consequence. He thinks he can do that which is right in his own eyes across all of Israel without consequence as well. Matthew Henry said, in politics, those commonly most ambitious are oftentimes least fit for it. Had Absalom petitioned his father to employ him in the administration of justice and study to qualify himself to be a judge of the law, no doubt David would have allowed him to do that. But here it's a lack of consequence for his murder that sparked his ambition in him, because he is now thinking himself somewhat above the law. He must be supreme or nothing. He wants to be such a judge that every man who has any cause shall come to him, in all causes and over all people he must preside. Not realizing how tiring that whole process is. Moses himself did that, and he really could not bear it. And the way he stole the hearts of the people was pretty smart too. He rose up. I'm going to skip that. I'm running out of time. When David gets word about how he lost the hearts of the people, it was painful to see him driven from his home and his throne by his beloved son. He actually wrote a psalm about being chased out of Jerusalem by Absalom. That's Psalm 3. I don't have time to read that. In chapter 15 to 17, you get a lot of details about David's journey away from Jerusalem and Absalom's return to Jerusalem and taking over the throne. And there is a verse I want to point out real quick. Chapter 16 and verse 20. This is really interesting. You remember when David left, when David departed from Jerusalem, he left the concubines to keep the house. You remember that? So in chapter 16 and verse 20, Then said Absalom to this counselor, give counselor among you what we shall do, now that he has returned to Jerusalem and David is gone. And Ahithophel said unto Absalom, go in unto thy father's concubines, which he hath left to keep the house, and all Israel shall hear that thou art abhorred of thy father. Then shall the hands of all that are with thee be strong. So they spread Absalom a tent upon the top of the house, and Absalom went in unto his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. And the counsel of Ahithophel, which he had counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. And the amazing point here about Absalom is that he was no better than his brother that he murdered. What he did with those concubines was worthy of death, just as what his brother did to his sister. He was not morally superior enough to carry out judgment on his brother. In chapter 17, David and his army and Absalom and his army kind of circle each other. And then in chapter 18, we get to the climax, and I want to read that really quickly. Chapter 18 and verse 1. This is an amazing climax. And David numbered the people that were with him, and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. And David sent forth a third part of the people under the hand of Joab, and a third part under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and a third part under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said unto the people, I will surely go forth with you myself also. And the people answered, Thou shalt not go forth, for if we flee away, they will not care for us. Neither if half of us die, will they care for us. But now thou art worth 10,000 of us. Therefore now it is better that thou succour us out of the city. And the king said unto them, What seemeth you best, I will do. And the king stood by the gate side, and all the people came out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Deal gently for my sake with the young man, even Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains charge concerning Absalom. So the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the wood of Ephraim, where the people of Israel were slain before the servants of David, and there was a great slaughter that day of 20,000 men. For the battle was there scattered over the face of all the country, and the wood devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. And Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak. And his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up, between the heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away. And a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, Behold, I saw Absalom hanged in an oak. And Joab said unto the man that told him, And behold, thou sawest him, and why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? And I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver and a girdle. And the man said unto Joab, Though I should receive 1,000 shekels of silver in mine hand, yet I would not put forth mine hand against the king's son, for in our hearing the king charged thee and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Beware that none touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise I would have wrought falsehood against my own life, for there is no matter hid from the king, and thou thyself wouldest have set thyself against me. Then said Joab, I may not tarry thus with thee. And he took 3 darts in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom, while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men that bare Joab's armor compassed about and smote Absalom and slew him. And Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing after Israel, for Joab held back the people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a great pit in the wood, and laid a very great heap of stones upon him, and all Israel fled every one to his tent. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and reared up for himself a pillar which is in the king's dale, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and it is called unto this day Absalom's place, which they think they may have found. Then said Ahimaaz the son of Zadok, Let me now run and bear the king tidings, how that the Lord hath avenged him of his enemies. And Joab said unto him, Thou shalt not bear tidings this day, but thou shalt bear tidings another day. But this day thou shalt bear no tidings, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to Cushi, Go tell the king what thou hast seen. And Cushi bowed himself unto Joab and ran. Then said Ahimaaz the son of Zadok yet again to Joab, But howsoever, let me, I pray thee, also run after Cushi. And Joab said, Wherefore wilt thou run, my son, seeing that thou hast no tidings ready? But howsoever, said he, let me run. And he said unto him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain, and overran Cushi. And David sat between the 2 gates. And the watchman went up to the roof over the gate under the wall, and lifted up his eyes, and looked, and behold, a man running alone. And the watchman cried and told the king, and the king said, If he be alone, there is tidings in his mouth. And he came apiece and drew near. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called unto the porter, and said, Behold, another man running alone. And the king said, He also bringeth tidings. And I'm going to skip a lot of this here. How about verse 29? And the king said, Is the young man Absalom safe? And Ahimaaz answered, When Joab sent the king's servant, and me, thy servant, I saw a great tumult, but I knew not what it was. And the king said unto him, Turn aside and stand here. And he turned aside and stood still. And behold, Cushi came. And Cushi said, Tidings, my lord the king, for the Lord hath avenged thee this day all of them that rose up against thee. And the king said unto Cushi, Is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushi answered, The enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. And the king was much moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate, and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. That's the ending to that story. David forgets all the joys of his victory, and he's quite overwhelmed with the sorrow tidings of Absalom's death. As soon as he perceived by Cushi's reply that Absalom was dead, he asked no more questions, but fell into a passion of weeping, and abandoned himself to sorrow. As he was going up to his chamber, he was overheard saying, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, alas for thee, I lament thee, how hast thou fallen? Would God I had died for thee, and that thou hast remained alive this day. And I can't help but wonder if that the reason he wished he had died for him was because he had good hopes of Absalom's salvation, of Absalom's repentance if he had lived. It rather seems to have been spoken inconsiderately and in a passion, and it was his infirmity. And I'll just close with this. Gabeline said that David regarded the conduct of Absalom for his own guilt as so grievous in his eyes that in comparison with it he deems Absalom's wickedness to be inconsiderable. And hence arises the deep and boundless compassion with which he surveys his reprobate son. David's treatment of Shimei may be regarded in the same light. His consciousness of his own great guilt causes him to overlook the guilt of that criminal. By the time you get to chapter 20, David's return to the throne. Does anybody have any thoughts? I'm running late. Ellen.
In Psalm, he talks about adultery, and I think this is where David was. He said, "Men do not despise a thief to steal, if he steals to satisfy his own soul when he's hungry, but if he be found, he shall restore sevenfold and give all the substance of his house." You can be restored and forgiven if you steal for what you need. But then the very next verse says, "But whoso committeth adultery with a woman lacketh understanding. He that doeth it destroyeth his own soul." Yeah, I'm hearing an echo.
Yeah.
"A wound and dishonor shall he get, and his reproach shall not be wiped away." And I think that for David, his reproach was not ever wiped away. And I think all of those things that happened between his sons and himself and his daughter and his concubines, all of that was just caught up in the fact that there was no understanding of the deed in the very beginning and of the length and the depth of the reproach that would remain.
That's a great comment. I don't have anything to say to that. Yeah. That's a great comment. Anybody else? Hal, do you have any thoughts?
I was going to say, did that also not contribute to the fact that David was not allowed to build the house of God?
Right, right.
His son?
Right.
It just would never quit.
Right. Because of the sword.
Yeah.
Right. Sherry.
It seems to me that it was a lot like today. One sin
George.
is
Is it?
one sin is covered up by committing another sin, and then the bigger sin has to cover up the two sins, and it just is a bridge that builds
Right.
until everything tumbles down.
Right.
The reproach just goes on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the moral here is that you just stay on that perfect walk, because a grievous sin like what David did has an impact on future generations. And that weakened him in terms of disciplining his son and being the example he needed to be. It really complicated his whole family.
Life.
Yeah. All right. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much just for this story, for us to just have the chance to look at one of the old stories and the example by King David. And I just pray that we may learn from that example and let this story stick with us and inspire us to continue to live in service and honor of you and to glorify your Son. And we are just so very grateful for everything that we have in Christ. And we love you so very, very much. And thank you for everything. In Christ's name, amen. Thank you.